On September 12, 1683, 18,000 cavalry thundered down the Kallenberg Heights in a single devastating charge that shattered the largest army in Ottoman history and saved European civilization from Islamic conquest. The ground shook under 72,000 hooves as Polish winged hussars led the most decisive cavalry assault ever recorded. In 18 minutes of pure kinetic violence, King Jan Sobieski's relief force obliterated a 150,000-strong siege army that had held Vienna captive for 2 months. When the dust settled, the Ottoman Empire's 300-year expansion into Europe was finished forever. Picture this. You're standing on Vienna's shattered walls on September 11, watching 150,000 enemy warriors camped in a crescent stretching 25 kilometers around your dying city. Turkish siege guns pound your defenses with 24-pound iron balls. Ottoman sappers tunnel beneath your feet, preparing to explode the last intact bastions. Your garrison of 11,000 defenders has been reduced to eating leather and rats. The Sultan's green banners flutter from positions just 100 meters from your gates. But here's what the Ottoman chronicles won't tell you about September 12th. Before we descend into the most decisive 18 minutes in European military history,
another win for me.
Hit that subscribe button for medieval spirits. Because what you're about to discover is how Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa commanded the largest Ottoman force ever assembled. 60,000 elite janissaries, 40,000 Sipahi cavalry, 50,000 irregulars, yet made one fatal tactical error that doomed his entire army. How Vienna's 11,000 defenders endured 59 days of starvation, disease, and constant bombardment while eating rats and drinking fouled water. How King Jan Sobieski force-marched 60,000 Christian warriors 300 kilometers in 15 days through hostile territory. How the Polish king waited 4 hours on September 12th, letting his allies bleed while positioning 150,000 enemies exactly where his cavalry could destroy them. How 18,000 armored horsemen charging at 30 kilometers per hour generated kinetic energy equivalent to automobile collisions when they hit the Ottoman line. And how the 450-to-1 casualty ratio, 20,000 Turks dead versus 400 Christian cavalry losses, permanently ended Islamic expansion into Europe. This isn't legend. This is physics, mathematics, and perfect timing weaponized into the largest cavalry charge ever recorded. Now let's go back to July 14th and watch how an empire's overconfidence built the trap that would destroy it. The siege began at dawn on July 14th, 1683, with the thunder of 130 Ottoman cannons unleashing hell upon Vienna's ancient walls. Kara Mustafa's artillery barrage shook buildings 3 miles away as 24-pound iron balls smashed into the Luhl-and-Berg bastions. Within hours, chunks of masonry tumbled into the moats, while Turkish engineers measured angles for their devastating mining operations. The Grand Vizier watched from his silk pavilion, stroking his beard as he calculated the mathematics of conquest. 60 days, he told his war council. Vienna would fall
The
in
angle of
60
the apex
days.
is 42.
By the third week
Noted.
of July, the Ottoman
range is
siege
accurate,
machine
700
demonstrated
cubits.
why it had conquered half of Europe. Turkish sappers, veterans of Belgrade and Budapest, began their underground war, digging approach trenches that zigzagged toward Vienna's walls, each section protected by gabions stuffed with earth and stone. Behind these earthworks, Janissary marksmen with long-barreled muskets picked off any defender who showed his head above the ramparts. The real terror came from beneath. Ottoman mining corps, recruited from the silver mines of Anatolia, tunneled through Vienna's clay subsoil with precision that terrified the defenders. Each underground gallery advanced 20 meters per week toward the foundation stones of the bastions. Count Starhemberg's counterminers worked frantically to intercept these tunnels, fighting desperate subterranean battles in chambers barely wide enough for a sword thrust. The sound of Turkish pickaxes grew louder each day, a constant reminder that death was digging toward them through the darkness. Vienna's defenders weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting time itself. The city's grain stores, calculated to feed 50,000 civilians and soldiers for 6 months, dwindled to 3 weeks' supply by mid-August. Horses died first, their carcasses dragged to mass graves beyond the cathedral. Then came the dogs,
prepare for the evening
cats.
prayer. Rations will be distributed.
The rats that infested the cellars. Disease stalked the narrow streets with more efficiency than Turkish bullets. Dysentery killed 200 civilians per week. Typhus spread through overcrowded cellars where families huddled during daily bombardments. The city's wells, fouled by decomposing bodies and human waste, produced water that tasted of death. Starhemberg's daily reports to the absent Emperor Leopold painted an increasingly desperate picture. August 15th, the enemy mines advanced daily. August 22nd, our powder magazine reduced to 40 barrels. August 30th, without immediate relief, the city cannot endure beyond September 15th. Then, everything changed on August 31st when Turkish mines exploded beneath the Lul bastion. The massive detonation hurled stone blocks 300 meters into the air and opened a breach 40 meters wide. Smoke and dust obscured the morning sun as 5,000 janissaries surged forward with scaling ladders and curved sabers. For 6 hours, desperate hand-to-hand combat raged in the rubble-filled gap. But as September approached with no sign of relief, even Starhemberg began to doubt whether salvation would arrive in time. And Kara Mustafa's confidence was about to make a fatal miscalculation. Ottoman confidence grew with each passing day. Kara Mustafa's dispatches to Sultan Mehmed IV in Istanbul grew increasingly boastful. The Grand Vizier ordered silk carpets for the victory celebration in St. Stephen's Cathedral. His cooks prepared lamb and rice for 50,000 warriors to feast after Vienna's fall. Turkish merchants in the siege camp raised prices on European slaves, anticipating the flood of Austrian prisoners. By September 8th, Ottoman trenches reached within 50 meters of Vienna's inner walls. Turkish marksmen could hit individual defenders from their advanced positions. The constant crack of musket fire echoed through streets where terrified civilians pressed themselves against cellar walls. Janissary assault troops sharpened their yataghans and checked their scaling equipment. The siege had consumed 8,000 Austrian lives and reduced Europe's greatest fortress to a hollow shell defended by walking skeletons. But here's where Kara Mustafa made his fatal error in position. The Grand Vizier had placed his entire 150,000-man army between the Danube River and the Kahlenberg slopes. With Vienna at his front and the river at his back, there were only 2 narrow bridges across the water. His magnificent camp silk pavilions in every color, thousands of cooking fires, the Sultan's personal war chest worth 3 million gold ducats stretched across a valley that would become a killing ground. The Grand Vizier's attention had focused so completely on Vienna's crumbling walls that he ignored the wider strategic picture. Turkish patrols, drunk on anticipated victory, grew careless in their reconnaissance. Not a single Ottoman officer suspected that the largest Christian army in 2 centuries was approaching through the Vienna woods. At the exact moment Vienna seemed doomed, 60,000 Christian warriors were completing the most audacious relief march in military history. Jan Sobieski's Polish army had covered 300 kilometers in 15 days, moving faster than any force of comparable size in recorded history. The Polish king drove his men mercilessly, knowing that every hour's delay meant more Austrian blood soaking into Vienna's cobblestones. His winged hussars rode 18 hours per day, their distinctive feathered wings creating an otherworldly silhouette against the September sky. Sobieski had assembled the largest Christian coalition since the First Crusade. 18,000 Polish winged hussars formed the devastating spearhead. 10,000 German and Austrian infantry provided the anvil. Saxon cavalry, Imperial dragoons, and Bavarian pike squares filled the ranks. On September 8th, a single coded letter reached Starhemberg through Turkish lines. 3 words in Latin that electrified the dying garrison: venio, video, vinco, I come, I see, I conquer. The Polish lion was coming, and he was bringing 72,000 hooves. The Polish vanguard reached the Kahlenberg Heights at dawn on September 11th, just as Turkish artillery began its daily bombardment of Vienna's ruins. Prince Eugene of Savoy, leading 12,000 imperial cavalry, crested the ridge first and surveyed a sight that stopped his breath. Below stretched the most magnificent military camp in Ottoman history. Silk pavilions in every color covered the valley floor like a Persian garden. Thousands of cooking fires sent smoke spirals into the morning air. Horse lines stretched for kilometers containing the finest Arabian destriers money could buy. The Sultan's personal war chest gleamed from beneath striped awnings. But Sobieski saw something his Austrian allies missed. The Ottoman camp's very magnificence revealed a fatal weakness. Kara Mustafa had positioned his entire army with their backs to the Danube River and Vienna's walls. If the Ottoman line broke, 150,000 men would be trapped between Christian cavalry and the city they had spent 2 months trying to capture. That evening, as Turkish drums echoed victory songs across the valley, Sobieski gathered his war council in a captured monastery overlooking the Ottoman positions. The Polish king, 54 years old, but still possessed of the physical power that had made him Europe's most feared cavalry commander, spread captured Turkish maps across a wooden table. His plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. At dawn, 60,000 Christians would attack along a 10-kilometer front. The infantry would engage the Ottoman center, while 18,000 cavalry massed for the decisive blow. As midnight approached on September 11th, Sobieski penned his final letter to his beloved wife, Marysinka, in Krakow. The words would echo through history: I came, I saw, God conquered. But first, God would work through 72,000 hooves, thundering down from the Kahlenberg at 30 kilometers per hour. September 12th dawned with the clash of 60,000 warriors preparing for battle. Christian trumpets sounded reveille from the Kahlenberg Heights as Polish, Austrian, and German commanders positioned their forces along a 10-kilometer front. Below in the valley, Ottoman drums answered with a thunderous response that shook leaves from the trees. Kara Mustafa emerged from his silk pavilion, expecting another day of siege operations against Vienna's crumbling walls. Instead, he found himself staring at the largest Christian army assembled in 2 centuries. The Grand Vizier's intelligence network, despite commanding 150,000 men and controlling every road within 50 kilometers, had completely failed to detect Sobieski's approach. The trap was set. The mathematics of destruction were about to be demonstrated with devastating clarity, and Kara Mustafa had positioned his army exactly where the Polish king wanted them. The battle began at 6 a.m. with Prince Eugene's Austrian infantry advancing down the eastern slopes in perfect formation. 10,000 imperial pike squares moved like clockwork mechanisms, their steel points glinting in the morning sun. Behind them marched 8,000 German musketeers in disciplined ranks, their match cords smoking in the crisp September air. The sight was magnificent and terrifying, a river of steel flowing down the hillsides toward Ottoman positions. Kara Mustafa responded exactly as Sobieski had anticipated. The Grand Vizier committed 40,000 infantry to meet the Christian advance, confident that his numerical superiority would crush this relief attempt. Janissary companies wheeled into battle lines with practiced precision, their white caps bobbing above razor-sharp yataghans. Behind them, 20,000 Sipahi cavalry formed in glittering crescents, waiting for the moment to deliver the killing blow. For 4 hours, the battle raged across the valley floor, with neither side gaining decisive advantage. Austrian pike squares held firm against Janissary charges, while Turkish horse archers peppered German musketeers with deadly volleys. The clash of steel rang across the battlefield as 100,000 men fought with professional skill and desperate courage. Ottoman sources report losing 3,000 men in the morning fighting. Christian casualties mounted to 2,500, killed and wounded. The mathematics suggested a grinding war of attrition that favored the numerically superior Turks. You're probably wondering why Sobieski waited 4 hours while his allies bled. Here's what Kara Mustafa failed to understand about the Polish king's tactical genius. Every Ottoman regiment committed to the infantry battle was one less unit available to resist the coming cavalry avalanche. As the clock approached 4 p.m., 60,000 Turkish warriors stood locked in combat with their backs to the Danube River, completely unaware that death was gathering on the hills above them. Sobieski had spent 4 hours positioning his enemies exactly where he wanted them. The Grand Vizier's confidence had transformed his magnificent army into a trapped mass with nowhere to retreat. The Polish king watched from the heights as Ottoman reserves flowed toward the infantry engagement, weakening their flanks, creating gaps in their defensive lines. His winged hussars adjusted saddles and checked lance points. Saxon cavalry tightened their formations. Austrian dragoons walked their destriers to keep them loose for the charge. 72,000 hooves were about to demonstrate that in warfare, timing matters more than numbers. The largest cavalry charge in recorded history was seconds away. At precisely 4 p.m., 18,000 cavalry began the largest mounted charge in recorded warfare. The ground trembled under 72,000 hooves as Polish winged hussars led the thunderous descent from the Kahlenberg heights. Behind Sobieski's spearhead rode German cuirassiers, Austrian dragoons, and Saxon heavy cavalry, forming a steel avalanche 3 kilometers wide. Picture this. You're a Janissary veteran standing in the Ottoman front line, bloodied from 4 hours of combat, but confident in your unit's discipline. Suddenly, the earth begins to shake. You turn toward the hills and see something that defies comprehension. 18,000 armored horsemen charging down the slopes at 30 kilometers per hour, their lance points forming a forest of death. The Polish hussars' feathered wings create an otherworldly silhouette that seems supernatural in its terror. The sound alone is devastating. 72,000 hooves hitting ground in rhythmic thunder, 18,000 voices screaming war cries, lance points cutting through air with a sound like ripping silk. The impact velocity was devastating beyond calculation. A mounted knight at full gallop generates kinetic energy equivalent to a modern automobile collision. When 18,000 such projectiles struck the Ottoman left flank simultaneously, physics became more deadly than courage. The Turkish line didn't break, it simply ceased to exist. Janissary companies that had held firm against pike and musket dissolved like smoke before the cavalry hurricane. The initial impact created a shockwave that rippled through Ottoman formations. Men standing 200 meters from the collision point felt the ground shake and turned to see their comrades simply disappear under the cavalry wave. The Polish lances, 4-meter-long hollow wooden shafts designed to shatter on impact while transferring maximum kinetic energy, punched through Turkish armor like tissue paper. Hussars dropped their broken lances and drew sabers, continuing to carve through Ottoman ranks with momentum that wouldn't stop. Within 5 minutes, panic spread through Ottoman ranks like wildfire. Elite units that had never known defeat broke and ran toward the Danube bridges. The Sultan's personal guard, 5,000 of the finest warriors in the Islamic world, abandoned their positions without striking a blow. Kara Mustafa's magnificent war tent, stuffed with golden treasures and battle maps, was overrun by Polish cavalry who trampled priceless Persian carpets under their destriers' hooves. The Grand Vizier himself, witnessing the destruction of his army, fled toward the bridges with his personal retinue. The pursuit became a massacre that lasted until darkness fell. Ottoman casualties mounted catastrophically. 15,000 dead on the field, 5,000 drowned attempting to cross the Danube, countless thousands scattered across the Austrian countryside. Sobieski's cavalry lost fewer than 400 men in the entire engagement. The 450-to-1 casualty ratio defied every principle of medieval warfare. In 18 minutes of pure kinetic violence, the Polish king had shattered 300 years of Islamic conquest. When the guns fell silent at sunset on September 12th, the killing ground around Vienna defied comprehension. Ottoman bodies carpeted the valley floor in windrows where Sobieski's cavalry had struck, creating ghastly pathways of death that stretched for kilometers. Riderless Turkish horses wandered among the corpses, their silk-draped saddles empty. High-ranking pashas, identifiable by their jeweled turbans and Damascus steel, lay twisted in the mud alongside common janissaries whose white caps were stained crimson. Polish cavalry chaplains walking the field counted 20,000 Ottoman dead before darkness forced them to halt their grim census. Drowning victims pulled from the Danube added another 3,000 to the toll. Prisoners numbered 15,000, including 400 officers and 3 members of the Imperial Council. Against this carnage, Christian casualties seemed almost miraculous in their lightness. Sobieski's entire relief army had lost 1,500 men, with only 400 cavalry deaths, despite leading the most devastating charge in military history. Kara Mustafa's magnificent command tent, larger than most European churches, fell intact to Polish forces and housed treasures that boggled the mind. The Grand Vizier's personal war chest contained 300,000 gold ducats in Venetian coins, enough to fund an entire campaign. Persian carpets worth a king's ransom lay trampled under cavalry hooves. Battle maps showing planned Ottoman advances to Munich and Prague were scattered among overturned coffee cups and abandoned hookahs. The Sultan's sacred standard, a green silk banner blessed in Mecca, was found abandoned in a puddle of spilled rosewater. But the psychological devastation exceeded even the material losses. For 3 centuries, Ottoman armies had advanced like an unstoppable tide, conquering Constantinople, Belgrade, Budapest, and reaching Vienna's gates twice. The aura of Islamic invincibility, carefully cultivated through generations of victory, shattered like Venetian glass against Polish steel. Sobieski himself, blood-spattered and exhausted, made the decision that defined his strategic genius. His nobles begged permission to pursue the routed Ottoman army to complete the destruction and perhaps capture the Grand Vizier himself. The road to Buda lay open. Turkish garrisons throughout Hungary were panicking. A determined pursuit might have driven Islamic forces completely from European soil within months. Yet the Polish king refused. Victory had taught him what defeat had not taught. Kara Mustafa. Armies, even triumphant ones, reach limits of endurance and supply. His cavalry horses, magnificent in their charge, were blown from the effort. His infantry, though victorious, had marched 300 kilometers and fought for 12 hours. Discipline had won the day. Only discipline could preserve it. Within Vienna's liberated walls, Count Starhemberg and his surviving 4,000 defenders emerged from their cellars, like men resurrected from the dead. 2 months of siege warfare had reduced them to walking skeletons, but they had held their posts until salvation arrived. Church bells that had been silent for 60 days rang out across the city. The age of Ottoman expansion was over. The tremors from September 12th rippled across the Islamic world like cracks in a shattered foundation. Within 3 months, Kara Mustafa Pasha met his fate in Belgrade, strangled with a silk bowstring on Sultan Mehmed IV's direct orders. The Grand Vizier, who had promised to plant Ottoman banners in Paris, died knowing that his defeat had triggered the empire's irreversible decline. His execution sent a message of imperial fury, but it could not resurrect the 20,000 elite warriors buried in Austrian soil or restore the aura of invincibility that had died with them. The strategic consequences cascaded across Europe with mathematical precision. Hungarian cities that had trembled at the approach of Turkish armies suddenly found courage to resist. Buda, the jewel of Ottoman Hungary, fell to imperial forces in 1686 after a siege that lasted just 78 days. Belgrade, the gateway to the Balkans, capitulated in 1688. Military historians discovered something profound when they studied the battle's tactical innovations centuries later. The Vienna Charge became the template for every successful cavalry assault that followed. Frederick the Great's Prussian cuirassiers at Rossbach, Napoleon's heavy cavalry at Austerlitz, even Wellington's household cavalry at Waterloo, all employed principles that Sobieski had perfected on September 12th. Mass, momentum, and perfect timing could overcome any numerical disadvantage. The Polish king had proven that 18,000 disciplined horsemen, properly led and precisely timed, possessed more combat power than 150,000 scattered infantry. Before Vienna, European armies approached Ottoman forces with defensive mentality, born from 3 centuries of defeats. After Vienna, that fear evaporated like morning mist. Christian commanders discovered that Turkish janissaries, for all their legendary discipline, could break and run like any other soldiers when faced with overwhelming shock action. The Ottoman Empire limped onward for another 240 years, but September 12th marked the end of its expansion and the beginning of its long retreat. Never again would Turkish armies threaten the heart of Europe. Never again would the Islamic crescent fly from the gates of major European cities. The tide of conquest that had swept from Central Asia to the outskirts of Vienna finally broke against Polish steel and Austrian determination. Modern militaries still analyze Sobieski's charge as the perfect example of operational patience combined with tactical violence. Staff colleges from Sandhurst to West Point teach the Vienna principles. Absorb pressure to create opportunity. Mass forces at the decisive point. Strike with overwhelming concentration when the enemy least expects it. The Polish king's 18-minute masterpiece became a template for defeating numerically superior foes through superior timing and unbreakable discipline. The silence after the last Turkish drum fell quiet on September 12, 1683, marked more than the end of a siege. It announced the conclusion of Islam's 300-year expansion into Europe and the dawn of Habsburg dominance that would shape the continent for centuries. 18,000 cavalry had thundered down the Kahlenberg Heights in the largest mounted charge in recorded history, shattering an empire's confidence in 18 minutes of pure kinetic destruction. When the impossible becomes inevitable, when discipline conquers desperation, when perfect timing transforms numerical weakness into overwhelming strength, armies discover that victory belongs not to the largest force, but to the one that chooses the perfect moment to unleash hell. At Vienna, Jan Sobieski proved that 18,000 men with unshakable will could indeed crush 150,000 with divided attention. So here's what you need to understand about September 12th. The mathematics weren't just about cavalry charges and casualty ratios. They were about recognizing that overconfidence creates vulnerability, that positioning matters more than numbers, that patience wins battles faster than aggression. Kara Mustafa commanded 150,000 warriors but positioned them in a trap. Sobieski commanded 18,000 cavalry, but waited 4 hours until the trap closed perfectly. The 450-to-1 casualty ratio, 20,000 Ottoman dead versus 400 Christian cavalry losses, wasn't luck. It was physics and timing weaponized into the most devastating 18 minutes in European military history. When you see modern conflicts where smaller forces defeat larger armies through superior positioning and timing, you're watching Sobieski's principles in action. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how one man's tactical genius saved European civilization. Leave a comment telling me which modern military operation best demonstrates Sobieski's principles of patience and perfect timing. Because here's the real lesson from Vienna. In warfare, as in life, the question isn't how many resources you have, but whether you know the exact moment to unleash them. Jan Sobieski waited 4 hours while his allies bled, positioned 150,000 enemies in a kill zone, then unleashed 72,000 hooves at exactly 4 p.m. 18 minutes later, 300 years of Ottoman expansion was finished forever. The mathematics yielded to mathematics properly applied.